Well, hello everyone. Good evening from the Ngunnawal country and welcome to the Center for Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance Conversation Series. I'd like to begin our conversation by acknowledging the Ngunnawal people, the traditional custodians of the land on which the University of Canberra's campus is situated. I acknowledge and respect their continuing culture and the contribution they make to Canberra and the region. Our center is based in unceded territory. It was and always will be Aboriginal land. And thank you, everybody, for joining us today. I'm Nicole Curato. I'm a professor of political sociology here at the center, and it's my absolute honor to moderate this discussion featuring our very own distinguished Professor John Dryzek, who's right here in front of me, and Professor Oliver Escobar from the University of Edinburgh. Two important people are also working behind the scenes to make this series happen. Dr. Adele Webb, our postdoctoral research fellow, convenes the seminar series. So thank you, Adele, who's also in the room. The magnificent Ferdinand Sanchez produces the seminar series and ensures everything runs smoothly online. So thank you as well, Ferds. So this seminar is part 4 of our 10-part anniversary special, during which we ask and do our best to answer key questions on deliberative democracy. And the question we are asking today is, does deliberative democracy stand a chance in neoliberal times? John Dryzek is joining us here in Canberra. Good evening, John. And Oliver is joining us from Galicia, Spain. Good morning, Oliver. So I'd like to kick off the conversation with definitions. In this conversation, John and Oliver both agreed to use the term neoliberal times in rather broad terms. Neoliberalism, at least in this talk, refers to an ideology, a governing rationality in a cultural paradigm that places stress on the markets rather than the public sector. Neoliberalism is accompanied by the need for a strong, if not authoritarian state to repress collectivism. So let's get the conversation started with you, John. In 1996, 28 years ago, you wrote the book Democracy and Capitalist Times. The book actually begins with a very fascinating anecdote about John's first political memory, which is taking down posters of the Conservative Party when he was 6 years old after the 1959 British general election campaign. So if you haven't read the book, I think you should read it at least for that anecdote. And of course, John, you said that the book's implications for the prospects for deliberative democracy under neoliberalism have not always been appreciated. So first of all, can you tell us the book's main argument and why do you think the book has been underappreciated?
Yeah, okay. First, could I ask you to show the slide, please? So rather than actually summarize the book, what I'd like to do is just show a slide, which is actually the opening paragraph of the book, which I think contains its main message. Okay, so I'm not going to read it, but I'll let you read it. Yeah, so the book is, well, the title is Democracy in Capitalist Times, and I was actually thinking about how it applies to the title of this seminar on deliberative democracy and whether it stands a chance in neoliberal times. And I realized as I was looking over the book again that deliberative democracy doesn't actually show up until page 110 of the book. And neoliberalism does not actually have an entry in the index. So when I was writing it, I think I was thinking of capitalism in general and its constraints upon democracy and what to do if you're committed to democracy in light of those constraints. In terms of whether it's been appreciated or not, I first met Oliver at ECPR General Conference 2 years ago, and I was in the audience. And one of the things he pointed out as he mentioned the book, but then he also noted that nobody actually read it. That may have, well, I don't know. I think some people read it, but maybe it has been perhaps underappreciated in the deliberative democracy field. However, I should note that it's actually the only one of my books on democracy that ever won a prize. It won the Spitz Prize for the best book on democratic and/or liberal theory, published in 1996, which was not bad considering that one of the competitors that year was Habermas's Between Facts and Norms. Anyway, so I hope you've all read the summary. That appears in the first paragraph of the book. So basically, given constraints on democracy in the state, we need to look for democracy against, apart from, across states as well as within states. So that's really the, in a nutshell, what the book is about.
Right, thanks, John. Oliver, I'd like to bring you in this conversation. Do you think the scholarly work and political practice of deliberative democracy has been oblivious or neglectful in situating deliberative democracy in a neoliberal context?
Yeah, thanks, Nicole, and it's great to be here with John and with everyone. Thanks to the organizers, and congrats to the center as well for the 10-year anniversary. I wish that at that conference I had said that the book has been underappreciated rather than no one read it, but hey, that was...
I'm not sure you exactly said that.
The point I was trying to make is that, you know, for a number of reasons, and I guess some of them are going to come up in this conversation, the field hasn't paid enough attention to political economy, and we don't have the excuse to say, well, that's because there was not much work on this at the foundational stage. There was, and John's book was a key example of that. I think the field does consider some aspects of neoliberalism and even capitalism, but they seem to me only considered when they are relevant to discourse or discursive power, the role of powerful interests, the media industry. But neoliberalism, as Nicole was pointing out, has become more than an ideology. It is a culture, it is a governing rationality, and therefore, you know, what is striking is that the field takes it as a given, as a set of background conditions. And this is the same point that has been made by Carol Pateman when she talks about capitalism as something that is taken as a given rather than something to be questioned. So when I was revisiting John's book, one of the things that struck me is, you know, the amount of predictions that have come to pass, which is not very common in political science, right? Our predictions are never that good. But in this 1996 book, you know, you talk a lot about economic rationality running wild and devouring democracy. And funnily enough, Nancy Fraser has just published her book, Cannibal Capitalism, which is about how you know, our economic system, capitalist democracy, is devouring the democratic, the democracy bit of it. So I think what's happened in the field is that perhaps we have accepted the boundaries of realpolitik as if it was a glass ceiling on the discipline, and this artificial separation between politics and economics. But things are changing. Even Habermas, in the recent book on the new book on the public sphere, he makes the case that, I think I have a quote somewhere here, there's a precarious relationship between the democratic state and the capitalist economy, which tends to reinforce inequalities, and he talks about social disintegration. So I think, you know, we're kind of, again, spotlighting this crucial dimension because many people in the field are interested in social change, in political change, in economic change. And therefore, the last point I will make, so if deliberative democracy is more than most people treat it as a theory of legitimation, and therefore a theory against domination and arbitrary power. But I don't think there is that much of a jump from this to a theory of emancipation. You know, where we consider more carefully social material conditions. And this is why I'm interested in the field of democratic innovation more broadly, because it brings together the participatory strand and the deliberative strand, so that, you know, the emancipatory and economic focus of participatory democracy and the discursive legitimation and contestation power of deliberative democracy. So I think deliberative democracy can be an engine not just for legitimation, but potentially social transformation. But there are a number of things that need to happen for the field to move in that direction.
Actually, John, do you agree with that kind of comment that Oliver made, that the field takes neoliberalism as a given, as a background condition, and hasn't been really sufficiently problematized? Because when I think of other democratic theorists like Jody Dean, for example, would describe democracy as a neoliberal fantasy. Do you think that's a fair assessment of the field?
Yeah, I think it's perhaps taken as a background condition, but also fail to recognize the constraints that imposes upon the possibilities of democratic innovation, especially associated with with the state. Well, to simplify slightly, taking up the argument from the book, democratic innovation in the vicinity of the state may be systematically limited in what it can do, especially when it comes to the core economic security imperatives of the state. So, for example, when we see that the French Climate Assembly had its radical implications blocked and not taken up by Macron, clearly it shows that the French state has economic imperatives which would not accommodate what the Assembly recommended. So that's how, I guess that's how I would see the heart of the matter.
And Oliver, what do you think is changing? It seems like the narrative you're putting forward about deliberative democracy is okay. It's a theory of legitimation, but increasingly we're thinking about it as a theory of emancipation. There's increasing attention on issues of political economy. What's changing in the field?
Yeah, I think there is what I would call a participatory corrective to the field, just bringing back some of the aspects that were there already in participatory democratic thinking and practice in the 60s, and which was always a foundation for deliberative democracy as well. It's just that it kind of got diluted along the way, I would argue. So, you know, if I was to put it in a very succinct way, I guess because of the empirical term in deliberative democracy, because of the experiences, as John mentioned, with assemblies and with other deliberative processes, I think people are becoming more aware of the glass ceiling to the field if we don't take more seriously the empowerment dimension and the contestatory dimension, you know, and in a way, I mean, it's not as if this wasn't there in deliberative theory. I just think that perhaps the social, or let me put it this way, there's a recovery of the critical theory strand of deliberative democracy, which to me is different from the more kind of the strand of the deliberative democracy that is more comfortable and more at home with existing liberal electoral representative institutions. So I think there is a revival of the critical strand theory of the field, and that's because of that aspiration for change and the recognition of the limitations if we don't take into account the socioeconomic underpinnings of the ways we build political life and political institutions.
And speaking of socioeconomic underpinnings, some people may also say, you're talking about neoliberal times. We shouldn't even be using that term. We should be using the term techno-feudalism, for example. And one of the observations we have in the field as well is there's, I guess, an attempt for big tech, right? Like Meta, for example, like OpenAI, also advocating some of the tools of deliberative democracy. There's a forthcoming paper with the Global Citizens Assembly Network by Nardine Alnemer and Canning Malkin, who's actually examined the motivations of big tech in hosting citizens' juries, citizens' assemblies, meta community forums, using tools of deliberative democracy. And they actually cite deliberative democracy as an inspiration for these processes. John, your thoughts? Is it ever in your wildest dreams for Mark Zuckerberg to read Democracy of Capitalist Times, Foundations and Frontiers of Deliberative Democracy?
I have a feeling he would read very selectively, and maybe not read the executive summary even. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that if we're in techno-feudalist times as well as neoliberal times, then can we democratize the neo-feudal lords? And in a way, sort of perhaps paradoxically, the neo-feudal lords, Meta and Amazon, whomever, are the constrainers. They're the people. They're the people who are constraining possibilities for democratic innovation, amongst other things, amongst many other things. But they're not necessarily constraining themselves. So within their own operations, it seems there is this sort of realm for innovation. Now, quite how meaningful it becomes in terms of their own can we imagine a citizens' assembly sort of changing the way Facebook operates? It's possible to imagine sort of some changes in the margins, but in terms of profoundly affecting the core of what Facebook does, I think that's perhaps a bit harder to imagine. But it's an interesting space to explore, I suppose.
Okay, I sense pessimism. How about you, Oliver?
Yeah, I think I'm with John on this. The thing is, this is a great example of using deliberative processes, not necessarily deliberative theory or a proper macro deliberative democracy theory, but the kind of deliberative techniques in order to shore up the weaknesses of their own kind of internal governance processes or whatever. So I will get more excited if they were using deliberative processes to question or to explore the potential for collective ownership of these technological platforms, and to change the logic of these platforms from a corporate space to a commons space. Now, if we were deliberating about that, I would be very excited about that agenda. But that's not what they are doing. So it is an example of capture. It's also, it is an endorsement of the power of deliberation to help organizations run themselves better, but we knew that already. In a way, this issue of technology and the power, the new forms of power in the corporate tech world, I think it brings us back to a question that was fundamental in John's book, which is about the role of the state, right? Because in the face of these corporations, of these monopolies and of these techno-feudal lords, this is a question I've been meaning to ask John for some time, and I'm going to use the opportunity here. And it's a question as well that my colleague Adrian Bua, who I've been learning with and from about political economy, it's a question that he often asks, and it's a question that I've been also wondering how you might address, John. So, because in 1996, you seemed to almost give up on the possibility of democratizing the state, and even considering the state as a field of a struggle for deliberative democracy. And you took a focus, or you kind of conclude that attention should be directed to civil society. That's where hope lies. I wonder if you're still in that position. I wonder if you still are prepared to let go of the aspiration to democratize the state, particularly in the face of the climate and ecological crisis, as well as all these transnational tech interests. Can we really afford sidelining the state in the deliberative democracy and more broadly in the democratic innovation agenda?
Yeah, I think you've hit on what is probably the most problematic part of the book, and it's it's very explicit pessimism, and so I do stress democratization apart from and across states, as opposed to democratization of the state. But the state clearly is with us and is likely to be with us for a long time yet as a dominant form of political organization. So should we give up on it? And I think the answer has to be no, but then I think we have to be alive to the constraints and not think that it's going to be easy, that if we just introduce enough democratic innovations, then that will somehow change in the vicinity of the state. That would change everything. So we have to be alive to the difficulties. But we also, and this is sort of perhaps sort of thinking through what the political and economic analysis might now look like, and think about when it comes to climate change, which you raised, for example, at some point, climate change really does undermine the economic imperative of the state. Catastrophic climate change will make things very bad economically, and at some point, states will have to realize that. And once they do, I think that opens up a space for more serious democratization. And so I think we need to think long and hard about what the possibilities are, but also what the constraints are.
John, do you have any questions for Oliver?
I guess my question might be, Oliver referred to the legitimating sort of function of deliberative democracy, and I think my question to him would be, this is not exactly a challenge, but I'm just wondering, is if we don't pay attention to these big political economy questions, is deliberative democracy potentially complicit in legitimating capitalist democracy, the kind of limited capitalist democracy that we already have, rather than being the kind of critical theory which I think both Oliver and I believe in? So that's it's not exactly a challenge; it's just a question of thinking about where the field, what we're doing goes.
Yeah, I think so. This is one of the issues I've been trying to work on for over the last few years, especially just trying to learn from some of the more recent developments in the commons and new forms of thinking about the economy. And I noticed that Catherine Trebeck is here. She wrote this wonderful book, The Economics of Arrival. There's a whole movement around the foundational economy, around the well-being economy. Of course, there's a long community economies. So there's a whole new space that repositions some of these questions and that are going to help us to think through. But when I boil it down, the way I think about this is, it seems to me that there are these two pillars of democratic governance. There's more, of course, but this is the way I try to think about it. There's the legitimacy dimension, and then there's the capacity dimension. Legitimacy to act, and legitimacy to govern, and legitimacy to act collectively, and then the capacity to act and to get things done and to solve problems and to address challenges and all of that. And the two go together. If you don't have legitimacy, you cannot mobilize the resources and therefore the capacity to act. If you don't have capacity to achieve things as a state, as a set of networks and institutions and policy spaces, then you lose legitimacy. So the two go together. And it seems to me that in a lot of deliberative democracy scholarship, we tend to focus on the legitimacy side, and then we just assume that bureaucracies, states, etc., have the capacity to then get things done, if only we just have better inputs into decision making. But of course, as any critical policy scholar will tell us, and that's kind of the tradition I come from, there are all kinds of challenges and all kinds of difficulties in mobilizing resources, in acting collectively, etc. So I think part of the problem is that we have placed so much emphasis on legitimacy, and we have forgotten, or we have not paid enough attention to capacity. And that's the missing piece of the puzzle. Once you start asking questions about capacity, then you begin to realize that the capitalist constraints on state action, on collective action more broadly, on the commons, etc., is something we really need to wrestle with much more seriously.
What capacity are you talking about, Oliver?
Well, it's the capacity to act depending on any given issue. So on climate change, it has to do with bureaucratic capacity, policy capacity, capacity across the commons, capacity in terms of what public administrations do in order to tackle these issues. And that capacity is undermined by all kinds of, for example, a lot of capacity in the state has been outsourced. Mariana Mazzucato makes the case that a lot of the brain, the public sector brain, has been outsourced to all kinds of consultancies and external kind of corporate actors. So that's an example of capacity that the state has let go because of the neoliberal kind of advances. But there is more than that. It's the capacity to mobilize people towards a collective end that requires shared purpose, which is the core capacity to tackle the climate emergency, right? So I think deliberative democracy needs to pay more attention to that, and deliberation is crucial to that, but it's just not all of it. There is more to it, and there's much more about power dynamics and about the things that are getting in the way, the constraints on the state, as John was putting it.
Yeah, John, any thoughts? Of course, you introduced the concept of deliberative capacity. How do you think that relates to all the other capacities that Oliver mentioned. And maybe if, I mean, Oliver's being quite polite here, but maybe since you're in front of me and we're all friends here, do you think the response of a discursive response to all the problems that Oliver mentioned still holds theoretically, given all the problems that we're facing right now?
Right. Okay. Yeah. So I did use the term deliberative capacity. This is much, I'm trying to think, 12 years after the book was published, I published an article called, what was called now, Democratization as Deliberative Capacity Building. And perhaps, how do I reconcile those? I think, I think we can think about the capacity of deliberative systems. And again, I think the term deliberative systems came sometime after this Democracy in Capitalist Times was published. So we can think in terms of the capacity of deliberative systems, which include the state, and potentially the capacity of those systems may potentially be sort of greater than that of the state itself. So that means, I mean, the basic, one of the basic premises of the deliberative systems approach is that one should not load too many expectations onto any given site in the deliberative system. And I think normally people might have in mind particular forms like parliament or whatever, and thinking of things in a broad perspective. But maybe we can think of the state itself as a big chunk of what any deliberative system is likely to be. But we can also think in terms of the capacity of the system, which includes the state, but it also includes things like social movements, civil society, maybe transnational, international organizations, and governance networks and so forth. And we can think about the capacity of the system in its entirety, rather than just the state narrowly conceived. And that might lead to thinking that maybe maybe the capacity is perhaps slightly greater than if we focus narrowly upon the capacity of the state.
Yeah, go ahead, Oliver.
I wonder if I could, because I think this, I think in Nancy Fraser's Cannibal Capitalism, public power is one of the 4 core realms that she points out as critical to change making and to try and tackle the multiple crises that we're facing, or the diabolical times we're facing, to use John's and Andre's term from their latest book. And in a way, I just want to make this argument a little bit more specific then, because I think I was being quite abstract there. So sometimes there is a very, and others have made this point before, there is a naive understanding sometimes of how policy works, how collective action mediated through public policy works. The assumption, for example, with many citizens' assemblies is that if they just produce something, then that's going to enter the machine, and at the other end is going to come, policies and measures and frameworks and investments and so on. And that's not quite, because once the recommendations of an assembly land in the state or in any other kind of public agency or other power holder, then we're back to the traditional domain of public administration, bureaucracy, policy networks, and everything that comes with that, right? So there are all kinds of issues of capacity within that, because public power, to use that term from Fraser, has been so diminished and so eroded, particularly over the last 3-4 decades, depending on the countries we think. But on the other side, on the brighter side, we have democratic innovations, for example, like participatory budgeting, that are a really good example of something that tries to accomplish things on both legitimacy grounds and capacity grounds. Because what good participatory budgeting, and there are all kinds and many of them are problematic, but the good versions of it are incredibly powerful at mobilizing new power by distributing resources and mobilizing civil society energy to get things done that could not be done before by allocating funding in other ways. We see that in Scotland, for example, with the emergence of green participatory budgeting, where hundreds of community groups, organizations, lots of initiatives in the commons are taking on that challenge of climate action, and PV is the catalyst for that. So to me, that's a way of mobilizing capacity. Other deliberative spaces don't have that. There's a lot of emphasis on climate assemblies and a lot of interest. Again, I don't think they are paying enough attention to the capacity side. So it's not just about the impact of the assembly, it's about the capacity of the systems where these things land to them, act. John was mentioning the deliberative systems approach. I think the deliberative systems turn was such a great opportunity to bring political economy into the conversation. And I just don't know why that hasn't happened more forcefully. How can we think about, I think Michael Sayward has said recently, why are we thinking in terms of deliberative systems and not democratic systems as a whole, right? Which then I would add, yes, and economic systems and the intersection between economy and politics as the foundation for democratic life.